Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Chester ARP Church Devotional Podcast. Genesis 22, sacrifice of Isaac, is before us. Mitch brings us in. Let's go.
Gives me grace for every trial. Feeds me with the living bread.
All right. Well, thank you so much again for being with us. Genesis 22 this morning. Great story. One of the most dramatic stories of the Old Testament is the story of Abraham sacrificing or being willing to sacrifice his son, Isaac. Here we go, Genesis 22, beginning in verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, here I am, he answered. Take your son, he said, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. So Abraham got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took with him two of his young men and his son Isaac. He split wood for a burnt offering and set out to go to the place God had told him about. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship, then we'll come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. In his hands he took the fire and the knife, and the two of them walked together. Then Isaac spoke to his father Abraham and said, my father. And he replied, here I am, my son. Isaac said, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide for the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Then the two of them walked on together. I want to stop right there for just a moment. I think this is one of the most dramatic and difficult passages of the Old Testament. I think for any of us who have children, or any of us who can imagine what it would be like to have children, the idea that God would call us to potentially sacrifice our children for his glory and worship to him is mind-boggling and difficult to bear. You remember that we've been through the story so far of Abraham and Sarah and the promise of God that Isaac would be born and that God would bless the world through Isaac and he would make Abraham a great nation through Isaac. And, of course, they went through the whole story with Ishmael and Hagar. They tried to take matters into their own hands. And then God says, because you try to take matters into your own hands, you're going to have to deal with the consequences of that. And, of course, we just read yesterday of how God sent Abraham sent Ishmael and Hagar out into the wilderness. Then God meets them where they are and protects them and takes care of them. And so we've seen all of that as it's unfolded. And now God comes to Abraham after Isaac comes of age to be able to carry a sacrifice, a wood for the altar. And he says to Isaac, listen, I want you to go and sacrifice. He says to Abraham, I want you to go sacrifice Isaac. Your job is to sacrifice Isaac to me. And we're told specifically in verse 1 that this is a test of Abraham's faith. What does that mean? Well, that means that God is testing Abraham's faith to see if Abraham is willing to obey. Here's the thing. As difficult as it seems for us to wrap our minds around this command, we have to understand it in the context of the first commandment of the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. We also have to understand it in the context of when Jesus tells those who would follow him, follow me. And the man says, let me go bury my father. Let me go take care of my family. And he says, no, right? You must follow me above all things. If we read it in that context, then we begin to understand what God is doing is not punishing Abraham. What God is doing is not taking Isaac from him necessarily. What God is doing is testing whether or not Abraham is willing to put his devotion to God above all else. Man, that is incredibly difficult when you think about it, because what God is saying is, Abraham, are you willing to worship me above everything else? Are you willing to devote yourself to me above everything else? Are you willing to make me your only God and not let Isaac be a God over me, not let Isaac be more important than me, not let Sarah be more important to you than me? Are you willing to say that I am the most important and you'll do whatever it takes to worship and glorify me? Now, we know what God's going to do. And Abraham, I think, we catch glimpses that Abraham is confident in his faith that God's going to provide. So later on, he says, as he's walking with his young men, he says to them, he says, listen, we're going to go over here and sacrifice, and we'll come back. There's the plural. We're going to go over, we'll come back. On the way, when Isaac, and it must have been a gut-wrenching moment, when Isaac says to his father, hey, Dad, we've got the fire, we've got the wood, but where's the lamb? And Abraham says, God will provide. Now, Abraham could be talking about the fact that God has already provided the sacrifice in the person of Isaac. Or Abraham could be talking about the fact that he believes that God will provide a substitute. But Abraham is willing to go. And as I read this and I think about my own life just this morning, I think about the reality of the fact, man, that is so challenging to me, because how often am I willing to put God above my desires, God above my family, God above whatever it is I can begin to use to identify myself, or God above everything else in my life. Man, that is such a struggle for me. I don't know if it is for you. And so the challenge for us is to say God will test us oftentimes the way he tested Abraham. And when God tests us, the question is, are you willing to put me above everything else? And that's the question you've got to ask. Are you willing to put God above everything else in your life today? That's the call in your life. Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow Jesus. We'll come back to this as we get into it, and we'll talk about how this sacrifice of Isaac and the substitute points us to the great substitute, the Lord Jesus Christ. You guys take care. God bless you. I'll see you tomorrow.
You care.